that subscribe button and click on that bell notification icon so you don't miss out on any updates from us. So in the agenda, we are going to discuss the roles in the web development market space, what roles are there, then why you would choose ReactJS as a technology in your web development career, the average salary of a ReactJS developer, the job description of a ReactJS developer, the companies that are hiring ReactJS developers, and the learning path that is involved in your ReactJS development career. So the roles in web development, before we actually look at the roles, let us look at a brief definition of what web development is. It is a process to build web applications that users can access using web browsers. So this could be from multiple devices like TVs, smartphones, desktop computers. So any device, any smart device that virtually has access to a web browser, the process to create web applications for those devices is called web development. So the first job role associated with this process, and the most important one as well, is backend development. So backend development is also known as server-side development. Backend, also known as server-side, is the part of the web application that deals with the data and the relationships. Backend can be built using many languages. Some of these include, so you might be familiar with these, PHP. It is an old language used for creating server-side scripts. Python is a comparatively new language with a lot of libraries and frameworks available to develop servers. And then we have Ruby. So you might be familiar with Ruby on Rails. Node.js, it is a JavaScript based server technology. And then Java. So Java, I'm sure all of you are familiar with. So these are some of the languages, most prominent ones used for server-side development. And then obviously we have front-end development. So this is what the users see. This is the part that deals with the user interface. So in front-end development, it is defined as the client side. It is the part of the web application that the user interacts with. It mainly consists of three technologies that are prominent today: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So these are the elements. These are essentially the bread and butter of front-end web development. So let us look at what HTML is. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It is used to define the structure and the elements of a web page. And then to style the HTML pages that we create, we use CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. It is used to define the style and layout of a web page. And then to add some sort of a dynamic element to your web page, you use JavaScript. JavaScript is used to add interactivity and asynchronous communication to a web page. So elements like drop-down menus or interactive chats, they are built using JavaScript. There are additional frameworks and libraries that can be added on top of this. So the front-end framework. So in the front-end frameworks, basically, they are libraries of code that take care of a lot of commonly built features in a front-end framework. So among the most popular ones today, we have AngularJS, we have React, and we have Vue. So these are some of the most popular JavaScript-based front-end frameworks that we use today. So we're going to be discussing about React today, not all of these three. And then finally, there is the full stack development job role. So if you are familiar with both backend and front end, if you are proficient with both, then you go for the full stack development role. So it is used when a developer is expected to know and work with both front end and back end technologies and databases. So it's always a plus to know both of these. So the front end should be known by you, and the back end, the server development, should be known by you. And then to integrate the backend with the database and handling the database, this is also a knowledge base that you should have when you're dealing with full stack development. So databases is also a technology that you should be familiar with. So in the front-end frameworks that we had discussed earlier, there are advantages to all of them, Angular, React, and Vue. But we will discuss today why ReactJS is a framework of choice for a lot of developers out there. So let us talk about React first. It is a front-end JavaScript framework created by Facebook. So essentially in all of the Facebook technologies that you see today, it mainly deals with the efficient rendering of components based on the current application state that you have. And there are various advantages associated to it. So let us look at the elements that make ReactJS such a favorable language. So the first is the JSX. JSX is a subcomponent that is present in ReactJS. JSX has a format very similar to HTML, and it renders just the same. So when you write JSX, you can write it in the way you would write HTML. But the main advantage that you get with JSX is that you can implement JavaScript logic within that HTML code, and it will simply render that logic onto your web browser as well. So integrating the logic, your JavaScript logic with frontend to reduce the server overhead. So you don't have to send requests to your server to get some data back. You can calculate it on the client side itself. And then we have components. So the code reusability factor and the easy to maintain factor come with components. So the way React works is that you write components instead of writing whole pages. You write components and then you can reuse those components. You can call those components like functions and implement it wherever you need to implement it. So say if you have a drop-down menu and you want to implement it in a certain section of your web page, you can simply call for that drop-down menu function and it will basically be rendered onto your web page. And the way components make the code becomes very structured. So it's very easy to maintain as well. So say if you want to perform a feature update, so you just go to the component that you want to make changes to, you make changes to that code, or you branch it out and you make changes to that code, and then you push the code back in, and then your feature is implemented without hindering any other code. So it's very easy to maintain as well, very easy to update. And then obviously ReactJS is a fast framework. It is stable and it is SEO friendly. So technologies, front-end technologies that are built using React, when you're searching for them, searching for certain keywords, certain elements with Google, it's very SEO friendly. So the search results would come up very easily. So what is the average salary of a ReactJS developer now that we know why ReactJS is favored? So there's also a quite hefty sum attached to it. In the US, the average salary of a ReactJS developer is $120,000. In India, it's 7.3 lakhs per annum. And in the UK, it's a pretty nice 57,000 pounds. So these are the average salaries of a ReactJS developer. So once you get to an experienced state, this is what you can get out of it. And this is only based on front-end technologies. If you transition to a full stack role, the possibilities are endless. So now that we know the salary of a ReactJS developer, let us look at the job description that is involved in a ReactJS developer role. So firstly, the candidate should be familiar with developing user interface components and implementing them with well-known ReactJS workflows like Flux or Redux. The candidate should be familiar with building reusable components and libraries for future use. So the main advantage of ReactJS is that we can reduce the lines of code in our web application, make it lighter with the use of components. So the components that you would build as part of your front end element, those components should be reusable in other places as well. So that is a very favorable point when you're applying for a ReactJS developer role. Being able to translate design into high quality code. So this is a quality that should be there in every front end developer, not just a ReactJS developer. So you should be able to look at a design and find out the most efficient way to implement it in your front end code. Optimizing components for time and memory usage. So your components should be optimized in a way that they don't take a lot of client-side resources. So they should be optimized for time efficiency and memory efficiency. Ensuring components are well-defined, robust, and easy to maintain. So the components should be well documented, well defined. There should be proper camel casing and variable definitions. They should be robust, and all of this would make it easy to maintain as well when you're dealing with teams, developer teams, and whatnot. And then coordinating with the front end team to ensure component integration. So it might be the case that you're working on one component and your teammate is working on another component. So you should be able to coordinate with your teammates in order for those two components to be very easily integratable. Coordinating with the backend team to ensure application architecture implementation. So whatever the architecture design is provided to you for your web application, you have to ensure that architecture is followed by coordinating with the backend team. And lastly, it's making the UI components that you build very easily accessible via multiple devices. So you're not just building your, in most cases today that you will deal with for websites. Websites develop their web pages for the desktop browser, for smart TV browsers, for mobile phone browsers. So your components should be coded in a way that they are optimized for all of these elements, so that when you open your components using a mobile phone, you should be able to see it in a way that it's fitting the aspect ratio of your phone, and all of the UI elements are optimized according to it. So that is a great sign of a React.js developer. And the skills that would be required of you when you're applying for these roles is you should know HTML, CSS, you should be familiar with JavaScript, obviously. And once you've learned JavaScript, you should also know React.js because you're applying for a React.js developer role. Flux or Redux, so these are workflows that you should be familiar with. Basic Node.js, I'll get to why you should know basic Node.js when you're applying for a React.js developer role in a moment. And then one or the other version control technology. So my recommendation would be Git. You should be familiar with Git as a version control technology. So let us look at some of the companies that are hiring React.js developers. So these are some of the top tier companies that are hiring for React.js. So you have Facebook, Netflix, Instagram, you have the New York Times, you have Yahoo, you have WhatsApp, Twitter, and Salesforce. So these are just some of the companies. Obviously, you can see all of the Facebook owned companies here. So you have Facebook, you have Instagram, you have WhatsApp and such. And you have other companies as well. There are a lot of companies that are hiring for React.js at the moment. So it's a very popular technology. So let us look at the learning path, or in other words, how to become a React.js developer. So the first thing that you would need to know is HTML. So HTML is the first thing that any web developer ever knows. So it's what you see. It's the basis of internet technologies today. The basis of static web pages. Whatever you see on your web browser essentially is a render of the HTML code that your web browser is making. So that is what you're seeing. Then after you have the base concepts of HTML covered, you're quite familiar with all of the elements that are present in HTML, then you would get to CSS. Now CSS is a tricky bit. In CSS, you should be familiar with it to a very high extent, but you don't need to be proficient at writing CSS code, because in 90% front-end jobs that you would get today, you wouldn't be required to write flat-out CSS, but you should know what the CSS does so that you can make appropriate changes to it. So that is what your knowledge in CSS should be about. You should be very familiar with how to make changes to it. And what changes would do what in CSS, but you don't necessarily need to know how to code CSS from scratch. And then you have JavaScript. So once you're familiar with HTML and CSS, then you go on to JavaScript too. And when you move on to JavaScript, it's essentially when you need to add some sort of an interactable element to your web page. So then you move on to JavaScript, you implement some logic on your web page. And then when you're sort of proficient in JavaScript, then you can easily move on to React.js. and it wouldn't take much of a time to transition into React.js once you're familiar with vanilla JavaScript. Then after you've learned React.js, you've understood how it works, then you can get into how to implement it in a professional environment. So most of the organizations that are using React.js today follow either of the two workflows like Flux or Redux. So you should be familiar with these data flows in order to implement React.js in a professional organizational environment. And then when you're familiar with all of these, when you've built some hands-on and projects and all of this, then you're essentially ready for jobs. Then you can apply for jobs, right? And one other thing that I would like to add is a technology that is very handy after learning all of this, or even in your learning procedure. It's Node.js. So I'll tell you why Node.js is important. So the reason it is important is that when you're practicing React.js, right, you need to be able to deploy your server in order for the React.js code to display, right? You need to be able to deploy your website so that you can see your front end, right? You can't just directly see your front end. You need to have a server for that. So React.js works with Node.js. So you need to know basics of Node.js as to how to deploy it into servers in order for you to test your React.js knowledge. So that is the only requirement for Node.js if you're purely applying for a front-end role. But obviously, if you're applying for a back-end role or a full-stack developer role, then you need to be extremely familiar with Node.js, because then you need to be able to integrate both of these very efficiently. So that is about it with our session here today. If you would like to contact us with regards to any of our courses, you can use the following contact details. And if you want to ask us doubts regarding these sessions and our courses and any of these technologies that we are discussing about, you can sign up for our webinar. The link for the webinar has been provided to you in the YouTube chat box. So be sure to sign up for it and join us in our next webinar for asking us doubts live. So that is about it. Hope you have a wonderful day or evening ahead of you. And goodbye from Intellipaat.